about them because the angers, the make them to look for help in authoritarian governments, dictatorships.
Pamiętajmy też, że sukces gospodarczy, zysk to tylko narzędzie do tego, żeby realizować ważniejsze cele.
We need to remember that the economic success, an economic profit, is only a tool, a means to attain other more important ends.
Życzę udanych obrad i wierzę w to, że wypracujecie dla nas ważne wskazówki, jak postępować dalej.
I wish you fruitful debate, and I hope that you will find solutions.
Życzę udanych obrad.
Okay.
Thank you so much. My name is Agata Stremecka. I'm president of Civil Development Forum 4, who is the partner of this conference in Poland. Mr. Felkel, first of all, thank you very much for hosting us here. It's the first time we are here at the private university. We're very proud of being here and meeting new people, new students. I hope you'll enjoy what's going to happen here. I would like to also thank you, first of all, Austrian Economic Center, who makes us partner for the 6th time in Poland. Thank you so much. We're very proud to be your partner here. And thank you our local partners, which is Centrum Kapitalizmu, Fundacja Wolności Przedsiębiorczości, Stowarzyszenie Koliber, Liberté, Stowarzyszenie Libertariańskie, Instytut Misesa and Kultura Liberalna. I think they are major liberal think tanks and newspapers in Poland. Thank you for being with us. I'll make it very short because this conference here today is for you. We have lovely guests from all over the world. Thank you for being with us. I know you had many adventures in terms of arrival in Poland, so I'm happy you made it. But this conference is for you. We will have our speakers, but then we will give you lots of time to discuss, and please enjoy and make this time really profitable for you. Barbara, floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Agata. Thank you, Mr. Völkel, for hosting us here. My name is Barbara Kolm, and it's a pleasure to be with you. As Agata has already mentioned, it's the 6th time we have the privilege to partner with 4 and the respective universities here in Poland. And it's the 11th edition of the Free Market Roadshow. So we have been doing this touring from city to city for 11 years now. And just to give you just a little bit of an idea of what this looks like, of what happens to our international speakers mostly, they, like tonight, they land at 2 o'clock in the morning coming from Kiev because the flight was delayed. Until you are at the hotel, it's 3 o'clock, and then all of a sudden, because of a mistake, 4 rooms are missing. So you go back to the airport hotel, finally go to bed at 4 o'clock, and then you get up here and run the show, inspire you to discuss freedom, for example. And as Agata has already mentioned, this conference is about the next generation. It is for the next generation. It's for those people who will make decisions in the future, who will be held responsible finally, and not, when I say held responsible for their actions, I really mean it. Because this is what we have forgotten a long time ago in Europe, on both sides, East and West, the West especially. And you in Poland were lucky to have politicians who did the right reforms at the very beginning. But sometimes you lose out. So it's your task to constantly challenge them and ask the right questions. Because I think what we all need is not only individual freedom, but entrepreneurial freedom, both. We need that to become prosperous, to grow. We need to be self-responsible, we need to achieve, and we need to compete. All those things are a precondition, not only for our continent and for Europe to survive, but for your own lives. So keep that in mind. And all our speakers here are here, wherever they come from, to answer your questions, and please challenge them. Because also there is this book here, by one of our partners and speakers. It's called Unleash Your Inner Company. It was written by John Chisholm. John is an MIT graduate, has made his way to Silicon Valley, was a very successful entrepreneur, failed, and this is the story about how you can fail, but get up again, don't stumble, start fighting again, go for it. And in each city, the best question, or the person who asks the best question during the debate, is awarded with this book. Trust me, it's worth thinking of good questions. And again, in the end, the team, I think Mr. Völkel and Agatha, will then decide who deserves the book. Make sure you leave the address here. We don't carry 40 books around because the roadshow goes to 40 cities, or actually 45. So we will send it to you from Vienna. We have a whole pile there waiting for you. One more thing where I would like to also set you thinking. We have a website called Values for, not like for, but for Europe. And there we want to engage the next generation in a debate. What are the values that we need to look at? How will Europe be built in the future? Do we need reforms, or shall we go for an ever closer union, or shall we just say, no, subsidiarity is a basic principle that we want to have for sure in our safe, actually, for the next generation. And there are many other questions. What about social justice? What about well-meaning people who give out other people's money? What about the tax issues? How can we pay for? Is there something like an entitlement principle? Is this something that you agree to, or would you rather challenge this thought and find new solutions? And again, Europe, or the blocks that have built Europe, are crumbling a little, so we need to fix that. And maybe we use new material to get this building either to we reduce the size, or we broaden it up, but it's your choice what you do with it, and we need your engagement for that. And lastly, there is, of course, for those groups who we work with, the partners, we would like to engage you as well, the think tanks and the young academics with respective institutes. We are a group of intellectuals and think tanks across Europe, because without them the roadshow would not be possible. And I would specifically, once again, thank for being, the leader here in Warsaw and in Poland to be our partner. But across Europe we work with 127, 130 by now, I don't even know exactly, institutes and partners to get this tour going. And we also stick for issues, or stand together for issues, whether it's now a coalition letter on digital taxation, because we think this is just another tax that is added to what is already there. So I think we should cut taxes, we should reduce them, we should simplify them, but not add another tax to create revenue streams for the European Commission and the EU. This is nothing that we actually think is good. And another topic that we have a coalition letter on is intellectual property rights. And this is something where you should listen to your academics, to your partners, to those people who shape the opinion. Because also, and to be very honest with you, the libertarian world is torn on this issue. Some think IP rights or IP doesn't have to be protected, and others think, okay, we should treat intellectual property rights like material property rights, like real estate or whatever, and should protect those rights. So engage your professors, engage our speakers in those topics, ask the right questions, learn, and advance and elevate yourself, because it's a constant battle that we fight. And lastly, I want to thank not only, once again, the university here, but also our international partners and sponsors. Because without those sponsors, whether it's the Cerebral Foundation, whether it's the Global Philanthropic Trust, and many others, it would not be possible to run this tour in 40 countries in Europe with more than 400 speakers involved. It is a challenge, but we love challenge. We are intellectual entrepreneurs, and we would love to have you involved here in Poland and get engaged. Thank you very much. Have a great conference.
Welcome the first panelist, Marek Tatawa, Vice President of FOR. We'll have his guests, Chris Lingle, Andrzej Kondratowicz, Marcin Matczak, and Richard Runn. Welcome.
Thank you, Agata, and thank you, Barbara, for bringing us again the roadshow to Poland and to Warsaw. My name is Marek Tatawa. I'm Vice President of the Civil Development Forum, and I will moderate this panel. First, shortly about the rules of these panels, we will have the short opening statements of our guests, and the guests have very different backgrounds, so I suppose they will also cover quite different topics. But the general topic of the panel is which values can stop the rise of populism in Europe and elsewhere, and this is something I think very important for Central Eastern Europe especially, including Poland, when we have the wave of populism, or what some people call the authoritarian populism regarding, for example, the area of rule of law. I would like to introduce our speakers. We'll have first Chris Lingle, who is the visiting professor of economics at Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala. Then professor from this university, Professor Andrzej Kondratowicz, professor at SWPS University. Professor Marcin Matczak from University of Warsaw, and Richard Runn, who is from the United States, and he is the chairman of the Institute for Global Economic Growth. As I said, we'll have firstly the opening statements of our guests, and then we'll immediately go to questions from you. So remember to have very good questions ready when you listen to the speeches, because you can also win the book, as Barbara said, but you can also run this discussion. So we'll have this just after the debate. And one last thing I wanted to mention is that if you want to read more on the topic of populism and authoritarian populism, what I can recommend you is that this little volume you can find all online. It's called Abusing People, Global Challenges of Authoritarian Populism. It was published by Libek, the Serbian organization. I was in Serbia over a weekend for the LibertyCon, and you can find interesting articles by free market or liberal, classical liberal authors here about Turkey, United States, Spain, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary. So many people here, including Tom Palmer, Anne Applebaum, and for example, Zoltán Kes, who was who was the independent member of the parliament in Hungary. Unfortunately, he lost elections, which were held last week. But you can find it at Libek website, and I think it's interesting volume available in English. So have a look at their website, and you can also find the summary of the book at FOR's Civil Development Forum's blog. So I would like to ask the first speaker, who will also have the presentation, to start. Chris Lingle.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. My first visit to Warsaw was in 1981, I believe. So I've been back since, but it's wonderful to see the transformations, the emergence of a private university committed to the ideas of classical liberalism and human freedom. So is he not able to put up the, what, I have to do it? What happens? Anyway, so, that's it. Great. Whoop, go back. Go back. No, go back. There we go. My email address is up there. That's the only thing. So I'm going to try to frame the general discussion, at least according to my thinking. Most of us are libertarians, so we believe in this sort of freedom of action. But this is my interpretation of what we could begin with to discuss this broad issue of values in Europe. And of course, these values aren't limited to Europe. I believe actually in human values. So I've always felt somewhat disquiet about trying to identify European values because we might try to assume that these are superior to others. Part of the reason is that I got into a dispute with the Singapore government over what they called Asian values at one time. So I tried to assert that human values are really what we're after. So what I want to do is think about how do these values originate, how are they transmitted, and what has happened today to see how they've transformed. So let's start with this idea of human action and the development of human values. So values are basically a guideline for human action. Now these things emerged out of the development of mankind and interacting with one another. And basically it's about the creation of incentives. These are the payoffs and the penalties, the rewards, the punishments for certain types of behavior. Now, these values initially were developed and discovered within relatively small and disparate, separated groups. For example, what we would now call tribes. Now, what happened, they were connected initially by blood or kinship of some sort, and the outcome of these values was to develop a social order within that tribe, something that they were generally comfortable with. Now, it turns out that there are relatively high costs of challenging these values within the tribe, because if you are a separate community and you're pushed out of the community, you could literally perish because you might starve to death. You wouldn't have the support of the group. So the tribes can have good or bad values. And even if it turns out that they're bad values in the sense that they might impose large costs on individuals or perhaps on other tribes, they might persist because of the nature of these high costs. Now, as mankind evolved and we went into more complex relationships where tribes began to interact with one another or to coalesce or to join one another in some political grouping, then we began to see the emergence of governments based upon these shared values, and this meant that tribalism retreated, that is, it went into the background because the interests and needs of the individuals became broader, and then something that we would call civil society emerged. And civil society is interesting because it tends to be a moderating influence over the worst possible outcomes of these sort of tribalistic values that might where one tribe might abuse another tribe, or the values of one tribe might go into conflict with other tribes. So what we find then is that if you contest the values of your kinship, you can escape it by joining another group. And the costs of contesting the values of the group become less heavy. Now, this thing that we call European values, democracy in many ways is one of the most cherished of all democratic values, European values. Or at least this is a claim. But we have to know what democracy is about. Democracy is nothing more, to me, than a voting rule. Majority or majoritarian decisions. The purpose of democracy was to guarantee and promote human liberty as the basis of personal dignity, the development of the... that came off of that. So, I kept... now, and property. Now, property is an essential element of human liberty, so democracy was intended to be just that. And it was supported by the rule of law, so that one important element of the rule of law is that no privileges be granted to any individual, whether the sovereign, whether a civil servant, or whether any individual would not be privileged over any other citizen. All citizens would be treated equally. Now, out of that comes something that we identify as liberalism and tolerance, where we accept that other people are different than we are, and we tolerate this. In fact, in my view, as a libertarian, you celebrate these differences. Bourgeois virtues evolved out of this. Deidre McCluskey, who had joined our roadshow 2 years ago here in Warsaw, has written a trilogy of books on this, describing these very essential elements of human behavior that support the free society. Now, what happened over time, though, is that this thing we call democracy that was supposed to protect us, our property, our human liberty, has deteriorated into what I would call a redistributive game. And that means that essentially democracy has become a mechanism by which tribal interests, or what is known as special interest groups, band together to demand from the state certain privileges that are available to their group that are paid for by the rest. So this is a natural and unfortunate development. Marx said that capitalism had fatal and internal contradictions, and he went on to explain these. I would argue to you that democracy has fatal and internal contradictions. And what we're beginning to see is that the consolidation and the expansion of these special interest groups has generated what in America we call identity politics. So people join together around a specific identity. It could be gender, it could be class, or any other category. So we're descending back into a form of tribalism. And so we've lost that moderating influence of civil society. And why has that happened? Primarily because of the development of democracy, which has undermined these values. It's made people dependent on the state. It's made people see the state as an instrument to solve their problems. But that means that you solve their problems because they extract resources or freedoms from you. Now, this is all of this ongoing discussion that populism is seen as a great threat to our human liberty. But the reality is, it's democracy. And populism is only one outgrowth of that democracy. If you read the mainstream media, most of the concern about populism is populism of the right, the Orbans of the world. But in fact, the populism of the left is, in fact, in my view, the most dangerous of these problems because they are so right. They are so correct. They are so unchallenged by the virtue of their claims to higher moral standing. But this is false. In fact, these are the same people who engineered the welfare state that has undermined these values. So, out of this, we begin to see problems with nationalism and patriotism that can become very ugly. We begin to see anti-Semitism or nativism, where we reject people based upon religion or national origin. And so that, I hope, will give you a framework within which we can discuss some of these more complex topics that my colleagues will bring. So thank you very much. Is that okay on time? The time was okay?
Thank you, Chris. And now we'll have Professor Andrzej Kondratowicz from SWPS University.
Thanks a lot. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I cannot hear me. So there is a bird. Yeah, there is a bird. Tweeting. Birds were tweeting before Twitter was actually developed. I am an economist, so actually I think this is a good idea if economists talk about things economic and lawyers about things legal, and we believe some specialization. Oh, now it's a little bit better. I hear myself now. So naturally I should, I think, at least a little bit concentrate on things economic as much as possible. But it's not that easy, I suppose, because if as an economist, you look into what academic more academically taught economics is, actually there is not much in it about populism. This is not per se an economic category, of course, okay? But what economists deal with is not only theory, of course, but also economic policies and institutions. So I think this is more about economic institutions and economic policies that I should concentrate on. And we've heard that some of you had some troubles last night and you couldn't find your hotel until 4 a.m. There are various reasons. Let's say this is a true story that actually I was working until 4 a.m. as well, just looking into literature, what economic literature can say or tell us actually about economic populism. And I found something interesting. That was already at the beginning of our Polish transformation, that other countries, sometimes continents, were really immersed in populism. And I'm talking about Latin America, mostly South America. Okay? So we embarked on transformation, about which later on Leszek Balcerowicz will be telling you a lot, I suppose, because he was the master of that transformation in Poland. But there were some other economists writing about those issues. That was, for example, Rudiger Dornbusch and Sebastian Edwards, two macroeconomists. In 1991, I found they wrote in the National Bureau of Economic Research an article about macroeconomics of populism. And what they were saying was sometimes astonishing to me as well. That was about mostly in reference to South America of that era. That populism is an approach to economics that emphasizes two things: growth and income redistribution. Income redistribution is obvious, but also growth. And so populism is always connected, or almost always, with the I would say a lot of propaganda about forced economic growth. Not economic growth that comes as an endogenous process, in a sense, out of our decisions on the market, but this forced process, like socialist economic growth, in a sense, forced despite all the costs. But on the other hand, they say that populism in economics or macroeconomics de-emphasizes other things which are diseases, or used to be diseases of our economy. Inflation, budget deficits, external constraints, and reactions to economic agents to, I would say, aggressive state policies. So these are the things which are, in a sense, costs of what populism emphasizes. So even if under populism there is some growth generated and income distribution happens, then there are large costs and dangers in terms of those bads in the sense of economic policy. Another point that should be made about economic populism is that historically speaking, it always ends badly. There are no positive stories. Should I mention Venezuela? Okay. Or maybe Argentina and Brazil, unfortunately, which were, in a sense, which embarked on not the same path as Venezuela, but as we see later, are really in a dark place, economically speaking, as well now. And finally, I would say that economic populism is always connected with, or almost always, with socialist ideas, with the ideas of large state or large government and its intervention, and with less of market forces, that is, with less of economic freedom. So actually, populism and lower economic freedom generally go hand in hand, and they are friends, if not brothers or sisters. Well, my predecessor mentioned the left-wing and right-wing populism. Generally, the left-wing is connected with egalitarian ideas, while the right with nationalism. And this is true. Actually, we don't have that much time at that moment to talk United States, for example. But if you take Donald Trump's inaugural speech, major slogan, America first, America first. What's that? He didn't say America the best. He didn't say most prosperous, but first, which to me stinks of populism, I would say. Sorry to be so direct. No. So how come that populism that used to be a typical Latin American disease started spreading actually, if not all over the world, but to Europe, to some of our countries, to the United States? And I think my answer is not that typical and maybe not what organizers expected, but I think that to a certain extent it was always here and there. Populism is lingering, it's hidden. But its resurgence is a political phenomenon. And I blame politicians and ideologues. That is a political phenomenon that is generated by clever, quote-unquote, politicians and ideologues using modern communications and information technologies and tools. Again, we know all those stories about big data, about Facebook, about Bannon, about Cambridge Analytica. But maybe we should go back to South Africa and talk about the British firm Bell Pottinger. What they did actually, disrupting the political processes of reconciliation in South Africa in a matter of a year or two, just by clever, quote unquote, again, use of modern technologies, and by actually talking people into this populistic idea and conflict, which was a racial conflict. Then the question is what to do. Lenin's question, in a sense. So, well, what can we do? Okay. But before I answer that, a short thing. If I were a politician in Poland who lost 7 consecutive elections, or, well, you probably know about whom I'm talking about. No? Oh, sorry, okay. So maybe if you were President Zuma in South Africa, to keep the South African example, and you wanted to continue your eternal presidency, okay, then what do? Well, you look at values your society believes in. You look at the world value surveys, you look at the Engelhardt-Welzel map of the world, cultural map of the world, and you see, for example, that Poland is so traditional that out of all the Catholic countries of Europe, we are far, 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 far more traditional. I am a politician, I want to win the election. So I start catering to this group. I take an axe, I chop my society into 2, and I only cater to this part, which is actually believing in those populist and very, very, very traditional and religious values, which are generally connected with nationalism as well, okay? And then I win the election. And this is what happened in Hungary, this is what happened in Turkey, this is what happened in Poland, this is what partly happened in the United States, this is what happened in the United Kingdom about Brexit. Therefore, if the question of our panel is what values can stop populism, I think this is an important question. But I think that the values themselves, they are not enough. Action is needed. Action which is promoting our values, our liberal values, our values in economic freedom and other kinds of freedoms, and showing what outcomes, actually good outcomes, may come of that. I'm a little bit pessimistic, finally speaking, that I think that we will have to wait a little bit, that also large parts of those societies and those nations which I mentioned will see by themselves what are the outcomes of those bad populist policies. But of course, we should support any action that may shorten that period of time. I don't know whether I have any 2-3 minutes or one. Okay. Well, actually, before we met here, our chairman asked me whether I could present also some numbers about economic freedom in Poland and in those countries which are of our interest. Well, talking about numbers without showing them is a little bit awkward, and I don't know whether it will be appreciated, so very, very briefly. 2 facts. First of all, when 5 years ago I did a lot of studies and surveys among general population and our former top politicians, everybody here was extremely supportive of economic freedom. When I asked them, the politicians, what did they do when in office for economic freedom, the answer was, we didn't have time for that. So I'm just waiting to make another survey in a year or 2 and ask those former politicians and general population in Poland whether they still support economic freedom or not. But what are the results? First of all, we understand that I am from the Fraser Institute network of economic freedom. So I use the Fraser Institute index, not the heritage one. We are also lagging in time. This is always 1.5 years after the fact, which means now we have data for 2015, which means that most of those populist processes which took place in Poland and partly in Turkey and in the United States are not showing in the numbers. So as far as 2015, we are still doing quite well. Poland is 51st out of 159 countries. We are actually very close to the European average, and that European average actually is almost the same for the old Europe and the new Europe, the old 13 and the new 15 countries. What may be striking is that the United States is not doing that well as far as economic freedom. It's not a leader anymore. It's a long time that the United States was a leader, by the way, because that was in the 30s, 40s, and the 50s, but not later, by the way. So the United States in the 11th place. And the distance between the top economically free countries in the States is rather growing. And I'm afraid, when I analyze, and I don't have time to go that, maybe there will be questions, that actually there are signs that also in Poland and in some other European countries, economic freedom will for some time go down. Larger government, more protectionism in international trade, and protection of private property going down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kondratowicz. Before I ask our third speaker to tell us about his perspective on this topic, I would like to mention that the main conclusions when I read this volume for me was that there are 2 things under attack by the authoritarian populism. This is economic freedom, and it is why I invited Professor Kondratowicz here. But the second thing is the rule of law, and it is why I wanted to have Professor Maciek in this panel, who together with many lawyers, NGOs, was involved in various protests against attacks of the Polish government on the rule of law. And when you go to this volume and read the first first article about Turkey under Erdogan, you can read how Turkish government captured control over the judiciary, and finally, by placing the executive above the law, all these developments left the principle of the rule of law in Turkey in ruins. We were protesting against what was happening in Poland because we don't want to have similar scenarios here, and I hope you and your friends will be also involved in other waves of defense of rule of law in Poland. So I'd like now Professor Maciek to speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. You know, I'm a lawyer, but today I'm going to talk about literature. In fact, about 3 books. I will build my speech around them, and I think I can inform you about values based on those 3 books. The first one is the great American novel To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This is a story important for lawyers because this novel depicts Atticus Finch, a great lawyer, a great attorney at law who is a defense lawyer for a black man accused of rape. And Atticus is, as I said, a great lawyer. He has great arguments, very strong arguments to defend his client. But unfortunately, he lost his case. Even if the arguments of the other side, the arguments of the prosecutor were very weak. The question is why? Because the problem Atticus Finch was facing was not a legal problem. The black man raping a white woman is a situation in which not the law is important, but some underlying social and psychological problems, namely racism. And Atticus Finch somehow neglected those problems. He believed that it is enough to be strong as far as the legal arguments are concerned. I think we lawyers, when facing the rule of law problem and crisis in the Central Eastern Europe, I think we are repeating the mistake Atticus made. We underestimate the underlying social and psychological problems, and the problems underlying the legal crisis. What are those problems? I believe that Poland, if taken as example, somehow shows what are those problems. When we fought with the communists in 1989 successfully, we had great plans, some values we believed in. Freedom from coercion. That was the most important value we believed in, and therefore we did everything it is possible to gain this freedom from coercion. But the freedom from coercion is only one part of what freedom is. We all remember what Isaiah Berlin said, his famous paper, that there are two kinds of freedom. There is a freedom from, like freedom from coercion, and there is freedom to, which is a positive freedom, a freedom to do something, to achieve something, to have plans. And we had such plans. We wanted to enter NATO, we wanted to join the European Union, and we again did it successfully. But then we ran out of plans. We don't have plans anymore. We don't know what we want to do. So there is something like an axiological vacuum now. So we are quite happy because we were successful, but people want more. And here comes the second book. Because if you have an axiological vacuum, you know that the world abhors vacuum. And the vacuum will be filled in by something. And the second book I want to talk about, and the book I want to recommend to you, is a German book written by Timur Vermes. The book entitled ist wieder da, or He is back. And this is a book about Adolf Hitler. It is a book about Adolf Hitler waking up in Berlin now. Now, not in 1933 or 1945, but now, in the 21st century. Hitler wakes up and becomes a celebrity. Everyone loves Hitler because he's providing values. He's not talking about the Jews because he knows that it is not very popular now. So he's not anti-Semitic any longer, but he's talking about values. He's talking about how it is important to be conscientious in your work, and he becomes a celebrity. So he fills in the axiological vacuum. The liberalism, the political liberalism, and the rule of law and the free market are the constructions based on the freedom from. They create a space for the people, like the free market creates a space for economists. The rule of law creates the space for everyone to achieve what people want to achieve. The problem is that they very often do not know what they want. And here comes the great narrative machines like the nationalism or patriotism, and they tell them what to do. And the crisis of the rule of law is a crisis of liberalism as well, because liberalism is not very good in providing plans for communities, because it is not compliant with the liberalism DNA. Liberalism respects the freedom from, so liberalism is not very good at telling people what to do. And therefore, liberalism loses to those great machines, the great narratives that provide values to the people. This is especially important for the young people, I believe. And here comes the third book. This is the book by the great Polish playwright Sławomir Mrożek, entitled Tango. And this book is about a family, a very strange family, a family in which parents are liberal, but children are conservative. Parents are liberal, they believe in the freedom from, and children are conservative in this sense that they need values to organize their life. And I think this book, Tango, describes what we are facing now in Poland and in Central Eastern Europe. I'm a liberal parent. I fought, in some sense, for the freedom from, and that was important for me, but I have a son, and the freedom from for him is like air. It is granted. He cannot imagine a world in which there is no freedom from. But he needs values. He needs some organization for his life. And if I fail to provide it, there will be someone to fill in this vacuum. So I believe that we should read Tango, because at some point in this play, a guy appears. His name is Edek, or Edward. He's very simple, he's very brutal, but everyone is fascinated with him because he has some simple values. If we don't provide those values, such people like Edek will be, they already arrived in some sense. And they provide values to our young people, to the middle class as well. Middle class is another example. These are the people for whom the freedom from was important at some time. But now they have a house, 2 cars, and they need more. They need values, they need respect. They need to take part in a plan that is greater than life. And liberalism cannot provide that. So the conclusion, I think, taken from the 3 books is as follows. We underestimate the sociological and psychological problems that underlie the crisis we are facing. Second, the nationalistic propaganda and the narrative is still very attractive because whatever you say about that, it is based on some values. These are bad values. These are values we should criticize, but these are values. These are values that organize people's life. People want to have such values because it's easier to live, especially if you are frightened, if you don't know what to do with your life. And third, if we don't provide those values to the people, Edek will come and it will destroy everything. So the question is, what values should we provide? And I believe that we should not look very far for those values. We have a great set of values here in Europe, but they are not very popular, they are not very fashionable. These are Judeo-Christian values, and they are very difficult for us to accept because the institutionalized religion made them, I think, not very attractive. And it is difficult for us to go to those values, to read the great books of our European culture, Greek mythology, the Bible, and to find some kind of inspiration there. And I can tell you that there are some values and stories that can be an inspiration for us. And perhaps you don't even know those values. They are very attractive. They are not boring, but we should go back to read them. There's one story I like the most. There is a story in the Bible about Jacob who fights with the angel. This is what we need now. We need courageous people that will be here to fight for freedom, because the freedom from is endangered, because we failed to provide the values that can be important from the perspective of the freedom too. We need to provide those values. We need to fight for this freedom, because if we don't, someone else will fill in this axiological vacuum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Matczak. And now I would like to ask Richard Rahn to have the last talk in this panel, and you can already start thinking about your questions or very brief comments about what you already heard.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be here again in Poland. I've been fortunate to have been in Poland a good number of times. I've spent a lot of time in what used to be called Eastern Europe, and both before the fall of communism and during and afterwards. And the progress you all have made has been truly remarkable. It's not, of course, Poland's done unusually well, but the Lithuanians and the Estonians and others, and even down in the Balkans and Bulgaria and elsewhere, you see enormous progress. The question was populism. And when I was assigned this by Barbara, I think we all have our idea what populism is, but I thought I'd look up the definition. There is no coherent definition of populism because it is not a coherent body of thought. It's not a coherent body of thought. In the UK, you have Corbyn on the left called a populist. You have Farage on the right called a populist. These two men agree on virtually nothing, and yet they're both called populist. I see some of it in the United States. We don't have quite the division they do in the UK and places in Europe on this matter. But as I've thought about this, it really rises from a failure of the establishment. Now, we learned that socialism does not work. Most people have picked this up, except for the people who rule Venezuela, Cuba, a few other places, and we have some politicians in Washington and the U.S. who still think socialism is wonderful, even though they've never experienced it, nor have they looked as far as Venezuela. But you have this huge frustration, an understandable frustration of large numbers of people, middle-class folks, who view themselves as getting ripped off by the political establishment, the political economic establishment. And it's true. You look at the very high salaries that civil servants pay themselves in a lot of countries, far higher than people get in the private sector. People are resentful from that. It goes further. You have these international organizations like the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank. They pay themselves great salaries. They are nags of telling the rest of the world to increase taxes and regulations, and yet they exempt themselves from payment of personal taxes. I mean, if you work for the IMF, you don't pay taxes, yet they're going around telling other people to pay higher taxes. People get this. They understand this. I mean, in Washington, we have these building after building, huge buildings of nothing but bureaucrats. What did all these people do? If you abolished it, would you notice any difference? One reason we don't really have government employees going on strike, other than people like school teachers or occasionally policemen or something, where people would notice. The reason the Department of Agriculture employees never go on strike is that nobody would notice. And you have, through all kinds of government bureaucracies, people there, you know, I'm sure here in Poland I haven't really looked at it in a way, but I was in Berlin and I was looking at all these new government office buildings. They're rebuilding Berlin, and it's this big government town. But there's buildings being built just to build big, beautiful buildings with no real purpose at all. If they were never built and they were never occupied, nobody would ever notice. In fact, people would be better off because you wouldn't have that particular burden. I'm an empiricist. I look around the world at what works. And I've spent much of my life working in poor countries, middle-class countries, the transition countries, and of course the developed world. And the economic rules are the same. And people always used to tell me, in this particular country, things are different. The rules didn't apply. I had chaired the Bulgarian transition team back in 1990, and I remember the Bulgarians tried to tell me they were different than other folks. The rules didn't apply. course, the rules do apply. And Bulgaria has been plagued by the lack of rule of law, the corruption. It's getting better, but this is a thing that's held them back. Every country needs the rule of law, and without the rule of law, nothing else works. As next to me here, Marcin is a lawyer, and I wish I had thought more about the rule of law when I first started doing economic reform projects. As an American, we basically had a fairly good rule of law. Our judges, for the most part, were reasonably competent. Rarely were they corrupt. And when I got in a place like Bulgaria, I couldn't believe the degree of corruption. And I began to understand, no matter what we did in terms of taxes and privatization and trade policy, none of it made any difference without the rule of law. And if you don't have that fundamental, and that's one reason for the rise of populism, is we see the decline in the rule of law. I think you mentioned the decline of the rule of law in the United States. It's been small, but it's been happening. Right now, we have big questions, you've probably seen on the news, with our own Justice Department. Clearly, the FBI and the Justice Department did not follow the rule of law. That is very bad for society. If you can't trust the cops and the prosecutors to play square, nothing else will really work. I think we'll overcome it and do the necessary reforms, being an optimist that I am. Property rights. All good economists understand the importance of property rights. And property rights, they were so important in this part of the world once you got rid of the communists. And getting the proper land registries and getting a recording of real property rights, terribly important to get the economy going. Without knowing who owns what, without having the right to own property and dispose of it in a lawful manner, nothing else really works. People don't invest in places where there are property rights have been destroyed. Again, I use Venezuela. It's nice having Venezuela there as a very bad example. Property rights have been destroyed. Nobody from the outside is investing in Venezuela, nor would any sensible person. Free markets. For the most part, these have not been much interfered with around the world. People have learned and price controls don't work. Price controls were actually a bigger problem 50 years ago. I'm talking about the non-socialist countries. Many cities in the U.S. had price controls on apartments and a lot of other areas. For the most part, that is diminished, and it's diminished around the world because people see price controls don't work. Now, free trade, we've had the big issue there that Donald Trump ran on his somewhat protectionist platform. Many of us who are, in fact, virtually every economist I know, criticized him over that. And there's been a big back off in terms of practice. It's unlikely that we're actually going to have very few tariffs imposed. Now they've just targeted the Chinese, but like on metals with steel and aluminum, our big trading partners were Canada and Mexico, Korea. They've been all basically exempted. And I don't think you're going to see much of a movement because there's been such a pushback on that. But this is, again, another thing that people start saying, well, we ought to have trade restrictions. It's unfair that some countries send cheap goods over that are subsidized. Yes, it's unfair, but the problem is all of you are also consumers. And when you go to the store, you want to pay twice as much for an undershirt because someplace has very low-cost labor or is subsidizing. Most people are going to say no. If a person gives you a gift, are you worse off or better off? Most people are going to say, well, they're better off. And this is this conflict going on. But for somebody who loses a job in a steel mill, there was a classic case. This goes back in the early 1980s. There was in the U.S. the classic case of the Polish golf cart. Poland at that point had no golf courses, but you produced golf carts, the motorized vehicles that golfers ride around in because they're now too lazy to walk from hole to hole. And the Poles were undercutting price-wise the U.S. manufacturers, a big company called Cushman at the time, and they had brought a trade complaint because this Polish golf cart company was selling in the U.S. at a far lower price, but nobody knew what the real costs were because those of you who remember the old communist accounting system knew they were all rather fictitious. And so we our trade office in the U.S. went through this elaborate thing of looking at a country that was at that point about the same level of development as Poland and trying to figure out what the price of a golf cart or cost would it be producing in that country to decide what kind of tariff to put on. But you got into these crazy things back during that era. Taxes and regulations. Here we've seen, I think, actually movement in the right direction for the most part. And that's the big reduction in marginal tax rates, particularly at the corporate level. Now we've got this whole rage now against the fact that corporate taxes have been reduced, particularly in the U.S. Some of the late night comedians have been attacking the Trump tax bill. And the other night I was subject of a good-natured attack on this because I'm one who argued we ought not to even have corporate taxes. But people say, well, those big rich corporations, Siemens or Facebook or Google or whatever, they're not paying lots of taxes because they're rich. But people never think about, because we do a lousy job in education, of explaining to people who owns those corporations. For the most part, it's millions of individual pensioners. Most of us in the U.S. and in Europe have our pensions in funds that have corporate stock. And we've all benefited from the great rise in the stock market over the last few years. It's not, Mark Zuckerberg, everybody focuses on him right now, and a couple of the others. Yes, he owns a lot of the stock, but the vast majority is owned by, probably most of you have stock in a number of these high-tech firms. You don't know it because wherever your pensions are, they own a little bit. And so the lesson here is you've had the rise in populism attacking corporate profits because we haven't educated people about what a corporation actually does. It's just a legal form of doing business and how the corporation isn't really separate from its owners, its workers, its customers, and so forth.
1 minute, okay? Last minute.
Okay. And the final item is sound money. And this is an area where I think we've made great advances in that we've had almost unexpected monetary stability in much of the world. The euro, the dollar, the Japanese yen, the British pound have been really remarkably stable and more stable over recent years. Monetary instability really leads to a great rise in populism and ultimately rebellion. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. So, as I said, because the audience is usually the most discriminated group and is in the end after the moderator asks the questions. So I would like you to ask questions or have a brief comments, but very brief. I can see the first hand here, so please give the microphone to the guy in the red shirt.
Thank you. I have a question to Mr. Maciek. Mr. Maciek, you mentioned that if Adolf Hitler was now in the 21st century, he would become a celebrity because of the values that he provides. My question is, do you think that now we have a problem of leadership and we don't have leaders who can provide with those values, to provide those values to society? Thank you.
Yes, I do think we have a problem with leaders, and we have a problem with the leadership of values, or what people call the leadership of values. And you know, you can see it both in Poland and in the United States, I believe. And I limit myself to talking about Poland. I think other people can talk about the United States. I think you cannot say that a leadership of value is a president of a great country in the Central Eastern Europe who tweets at night with young girls. Yeah. You cannot say that the leadership of values is a leader of the opposition who leaves his people who are protesting in the parliament and goes for vacation. Yeah. It is not a leadership of values, for sure. So I believe that we have a problem like that. Of course, you know, I'm the last person here to promote Adolf Hitler and his values. Yeah? This book is an excellent analysis of the weaknesses of democracy. Yeah? And I think we should all read it because it shows how such people like Hitler can be popular, can be admired even by other people. I think the reason is that they are quite eager to provide quite an attractive set of values. Yeah? And I believe that the liberal leaders are ashamed somehow of providing those values to the people because they think that's a kind of coercion. That's a kind of telling people what they should do. So I believe that's exactly the reason. The other problem is that we have leaders who believe they provide something like a leadership of values on the right part of our political scene. But again, I think this is the interpretation of the values that is far from liberty, is far from freedom at the same time. And what I say is that the great books of our culture, like the Greek mythology, the Bible, is full of the people who fought for freedom. I mentioned Jacob who fought with Angel. I think, I assume some of you never heard about him. Yeah? But that's a character to learn from. Ulysses is a character to learn from. Yeah? How to be wise in difficult times. How to sail close to the island of sirens and not to get crazy. Yeah? These are the examples of the values we should believe in. And I think we need leadership of values.
Can I?
I will first ask for 2-3 more questions and then we can have discussion here. So if we can have 2-3 questions now.
Hello. Hello. I have a question to Chris Lingle. As you mentioned, the process of tribalism, I want to ask you that, do you think that we are seeing the creating of tribes? And will they fight with themselves or will they cooperate? What solutions do you see for them? And what do you think, in what way it will develop? Revolutions, more differences between these groups, or yes?
We'll have one more question first and then I will...
I've got second question to Marcin Matczak. In my opinion, it's not a problem with leadership, but with society. In the ending of the book you've already mentioned, Look Who's Back, Hitler said that he didn't become Chancellor of Germany because he killed someone, because he won the fight, but because people elected him. And he also added that that was because people was like him. Don't you think that we need at first educate society to make them thinking more liberal, and then the correct leader will emerge without our reaction? And so, okay, that's it. I forgot the second question.
And one last from Piotr Oliński.
Maybe not a question, but a short remark to what Mr. Matczak said. Well, I don't think we have a problem with values, and I don't think that we as classical liberals or libertarians or people who think that freedom is a core value cannot provide values, because we have the values of freedom, of some kind of personal independence, individualism, and the problem we have is that we've some kind forgot about these values, and we cannot say that only the left or right can provide us values, because we have it too, and we need to promote them. I think there are too few initiatives when I look how it does look in Poland to promote freedom, which is attacked from both the left and the right, and we just don't have to give up with our values.
Thank you. I will ask Chris Lingle and then.
Yeah, this interesting point about what might happen in terms of these conflicts among these various tribes. We would call them now special interest groups. Now, the basic problem is the resolution of these conflicts becomes very complicated, because the democracy has created this consolidation of power at the center, where the possibilities of this redistribution of income and wealth between these tribes, as that becomes more and more contested, we don't know what the limit may be. I mean, there's a lot at stake now. There's a great deal of wealth and income to be redistributed, as long as it's yours coming to me. And this is the fundamental problem. So democracy has created, through the process of its own development and the internal dynamics, created this fundamental problem. We're in sort of what I would call a Weimar moment with democracy. It was the Weimar Republic of Germany had this crisis. I think democracy as an institution is facing a very similar challenge.
Okay, first question now concerning where is the problem. So is the problem in the leadership or is the problem in the people? You know, of course, we need to educate the people, but you know, education is about mind, and supporting leaders like Hitler was about heart, I think. Yeah? And just Weimar Republic that was mentioned, you know, you had a great analysis by Erich Fromm showing, you know, what happened in the Weimar Republic and what happened with the people who supported Hitler. Fromm is talking about the authoritarian personality that arises if people are afraid. Yeah, and of course people in the Weimar Republic had a lot of reasons to be afraid. Not only afraid, but also to feel that nobody respects them, that they lost the war, they have hyperinflation, and so on and so on. And when people are afraid, the authoritarian personality arises, which has this masochistic and sadistic element. The masochistic element is that they crave to be a part of something bigger than they are. And here comes the leader showing the plan and asking for the trust. So you may educate the people, but you cannot manage their emotions. And look what the Law and Justice Party, the governing party, did in their electoral campaign. Their main communication was Poland is in ruins. Yeah? Why? That was a lie. Yeah? We were a green island of the financial crisis. Yeah? We were a beneficiary of the European Commission of the European Union at that time. But this communication was to trigger fear that we lost something, that we can be better. Yeah? The communication by Jarosław Kaczyński about the new kind of microbes and bacteria the refugees can bring to our country. This is to incite fear. Yeah? And you can educate people so to address their minds, but the fear is in their hearts. So I believe that a great leader for whom liberty is important, freedom is important, rule of law is important, can be a cure for this fear. Yeah, because I think that Fromm said that if there is a difficult time, you need a leader, and you need a good leader, because if you don't have a good leader, a leadership of values, another Hitler will come. Yeah, and that's a problem. So of course education is important, but it's not sufficient. And the second point, of course, liberal values are very important. These are my values as well. I'm not underestimating them, but as I said, we have a crisis of liberal values because even the values you mentioned, these are so-called the values of negative freedom, individualism, freedom. I think freedom from coercion, or like in the free market construction or in the rule of law. Do we have a crisis of liberalism because it is difficult for liberalism to provide the values that organize someone's lives? If you tell someone, be an individual, it's an empty value because it must be filled in with your values, with your plans, and so on and so on. And there are many people, and believe me, not only in the countryside, the people who don't know a lot about work, in the big corporations, there are a lot of people who don't know what to do with their lives, and they are very happy to follow a leader. So what I'm saying is that you need to build, to add to our important values, like individualism and freedom from something more, something that will support those values and block the bad values to come in. That's my intention.
Actually, I disagree with my two colleagues here. Democracy never works. They started off, the Greeks tried it, direct democracy always is a failure, because eventually the majority tries to vote themselves benefits from the minority, and this tends to increase. And that is why we've seen this now, crisis, particularly here in Europe, and to somewhat extent in the U.S. When the American founding fathers set up our form of government, they mistrusted democracy. There is no mention of democracy in the U.S. Constitution. There's a mention of individual rights and basic liberties. Things like property rights, rule of law, and so forth are protected. It's very hard, given the nature of our Constitution, to undo these. Our American founding fathers were great skeptics of relying on the beneficent leader, that somebody would come along, to guide us and do what's best for us. They were basically public choice economists before the school of public choice economics was developed. They understood that government bureaucrats and the people who have entrenched interest are looking out for themselves, not for the common good. And our founding fathers were skeptics about the human nature. And so they tried to design a system which limited the power of any leader, no matter how good. And all of our presidents end up with huge frustration because there's things they can't do. And we see right now that Donald Trump is suddenly learning that being a private developer, he could do all kinds of things that he can't do as president. And he can't even run his own government. But it was designed that way. And that has sort of protected us. If you rely just on direct democracy or just a parliamentary democracy without external constraints, it will fail. It always has, every place in the world. And if you rely on the idea that you're going to get beneficent leaders, occasionally countries luck out and have a Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan for a number of years. But even with people like that, you don't want to give them unlimited power. And so we do need to educate people more that democracy is not the great panacea. We had this problem in the U.S. Everybody talks about democracy. We don't want democracy. Do you want liberty or do you want democracy? The people in Hong Kong, before the British passed it over, had liberty. They had all the essential freedoms, and they could They had very low taxes, but they had total freedom of speech and assembly, and all the other things were guaranteed, but they didn't have a democracy. They were basically pleased with that system. Their Chinese neighbors were not, but anyway.
Excuse me, I have one question. Can I? Okay. To Professor Richard Ryan, from the Latin language, institutia is similar to institution from England, and institutia means justice. And do you think that now in the institutions we have too much human aspect, and the populism will be resolved by rechanging the country's institutions to private? Thank you.
I'm not sure I totally understood your question. Okay. Okay. Maybe you could rephrase the question for me, or I'm not quite sure what I was being asked.
Okay, I think we can treat it as a comment and here because we are running out of time. Yes. So we don't have a break now. We'll have one more speech in the end of the panel, but please first say thank you to our panelists for clapping your hands. Thank you very much. And yes, we can move to the first row here because now we'll have the last part of this part of the conversation. Professor Leszek Balcerowicz will now give his keynote speech, so stay in the room and we'll have presentation here. So Professor Balcerowicz is the chairman of the board of Civil Development Forum, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Czy tak trzymać, tak? Działa? Działa. Dobrze. Well, thank you very much. I understand I have half an hour. I make use 20-25 minutes. Let me start with saying that in my professional life I've been dealing with various issues, but the most important of this issue was institutional systems. And I think this is the most important topic in social sciences. And there are 4 points here. First, you have to define the main variables. And nowadays we can measure dimensions like freedoms of various kinds, rule of law, etc. Then there's a question of cohesion. What collections of institutions can form a system? Meaning it can last, even if it performs very badly. Third, by far most important, is performance. We know that large differences or changes in institutional system produce huge differences in the conditions of life, not only economic, but non-economic too, like fear, generated by the government. Compare North and South Korea, East and West Germany. And this is the most important reason why it is very useful to study institutions. And fourth, dynamics. How changes or lack of changes. And I will focus on the fourth topic, which is under-researched. But I have to mention some other issue. I will skip lots of definitions because of time. Here. So you can read, my presentation is available. I hope you are used to fast reading. We need it. No, events are galloping. So you'll be very good at reading fast and, most important, comprehending. And first, drawing conclusions for action. Okay, now let me start with this. Okay, is it? Okay. Now I think there are 5 basic dimensions which define various systems, maybe more. The first is democracy, civil rights, rule of law, fiscal, economic freedom, and fiscal stance. And based on various combinations, you can distinguish very different systems. Let me start with democracy. There are various definitions, but I think the most useful is it's an open, regular competition for jobs in the state, in politics. And that's Schumpeter's definition. Now, to have a lasting democracy, you have to have extensive civil rights and elementary rule of law, unless you call Putin's Russia a democracy. Okay? And if you can arrest the opponent, what sort of democracy you have? So I can say what we call liberal democracy is a combination of three factors: open political competition, extensive civil rights, rule of law, and you have to add something which is usually disregarded by leftist staters, which is extensive economic freedom. Without extensive economic freedom, you can't have lasting democracy, you have a very bad performance, and this is the system number one, which is called socialist. If you're in love with the word socialist, call it the system communism, the same. If you monopolize the economy through state ownership, you crowd out, you declare private ownership illegal, you declare market transaction illegal, this system performs very badly. And how can it be maintained? By force, by intimidation. For that you need KGB. So you can't have rule of law, you can't have extensive civil rights. So it is socialism by necessity is dictatorship. And so if some people love democracy but dislike capitalism, that's a very strange feature, because with socialism you can't have democracy. It's impossible. So you have to love capitalist free market economy as a substitution if you love capitalism, if you love democracy. So this is the first point. Now there have been, many people are surprised that Islamic countries on the whole are performing very badly. Why? Because they are quasi-socialist. Iran is quasi-socialism. Only they don't have, the leader is not called first secretary but Ayatollah. Doesn't matter. South Arabia is socialist because it's quasi-status, lots of state power, and it's no surprise it is performing very badly. Now, we know that systems which are worth pursuing are called capitalistic, but there are quite a lot of variation. I can only mention that the best system, you can call it free market capitalism, entrepreneurial capitalism, which must include rule of law. It may include democracy. It's the most attacked. That's a strange phenomenon. And many people like to live under capitalism and earn their living by criticizing capitalism. That's, you know, lots of these people, yes. They don't try to go to socialism and criticize socialism. It's too risky. It was not very beneficial. Okay, that's a side remark. Now, you can describe various transitions. For example, very good transitions was after collapse of socialism towards the pillars, the four pillars of a good system: democracy, extensive civil rights, third, rule of law, and extensive economic freedom. I think this is what defines a good system. By the way, one should not base judgments about systems which are not democratic on one single case, which is Hong Kong. You don't generalize from single cases. Now, you have to look at the whole populations of democratic and non-democratic systems, and then what you see, that there are very few nowadays good non-democratic systems. Hong Kong and what else? But most of them are awful, because most of them are socialist or quasi-socialist. And the worst non-democratic systems are much worse than the worst democratic system. So Greece is a catastrophe, but it's much better than North Korea or Cuba. So compare, don't base judgment on single cases. It's a fallacy. Look at the whole populations of various systems. Now, so much for typologies, and which can be useful in defining transitions. Now about the transition. The bad systems can persist. Why? Because fear can be effective, unfortunately. And this is why communism has persisted for so many years. And it was a great, great event, including many chance elements, that it collapsed. And then you have various transitions which we are not going to describe today. This is a separate subject. But very good systems can be economically undermined from within. And this is a question of liberal democracy. And it means that a relative good performance of good system is not enough to guarantee their continued existence. You hear about lots of economic problems in developed countries, and they are not imposed by the Soviet Union. They are not even imposed by China. They are produced from within, and what is this? What is produced in the interest groups? So political economy in liberal democracy is mostly the interest groups' interactions, and there's what a great scientist, Mankur Olson, who made a huge contribution to that. I do not have time to discuss it. I would only like to mention that among interest groups who are influential, one should not only include interest groups which are ultimately motivated by financial factors. You can earn more with less effort, or you can earn more the same with less effort. And this has been extensively studied, and rightly so. Protectionist groups are these sort of groups, but one should distinguish ideologically motivated group. To have ideas is not enough. You may have a very bad idea. So the question is, what ideas are fighting for? To have values is not enough, because you have bad values like hatred and good values like mutual help. And saying we believe in values is not enough, because you have to communicate. So we don't have a battle of ideas nowadays. We have a battle of communications. And we have to be better, and there's a lot to do on communication. Why? Because communication matters in mass societies. Secondly, we have ideological groups who are hostile to market economy. It is an intervention by the hostile ideological group. You see how effective they are. Yes, but you may extreme ecologists as an example of anti-capitalistic groups who would like to have much less people on the planet and more animals. So one needs more analysis of ideologically motivated interest groups. We believers in classical values of the rule of law and individual freedom, we are an ideological interest group, but which believes in good values. Why do we know? Because we compare the conditions of life under freedom and rule of law with those opposite. And we draw conclusion, it's empirical. It's not on a blind faith, it's empirical. And why it's more difficult for us, but we have to win battle on communication? Because we are not appealing, we are not deriving financial satisfaction from our activity, as distinct from protectionism, etc. We do it for good ideas and good values, but what will be decided, I repeat, communication and organization. debt. And I think one should focus on this, not to preach to the same people how noble we are. Be more productive in outside activities. Okay, so on interest groups. Now, one factor which is under research is the role of economic situation under liberal democracy for the economic policies which change the system. Now, good times are dangerous because they demobilize. So when the European Central Bank is printing a lot of money, just an example, and says, we are buying time for reforms, they are losing time because they are weakening incentives. Because why, if politicians in heavily indebted countries can cheaply borrow to pursue bad policies, is it a good ECB policy? So what about Italy, which lost a lot of time? So good times are dangerous, especially if good economic situation is due to windfall gains. Printing money is a windfall gain. Discovering oil is a windfall gain, etc., etc. What about bad economic situation? Is it good for reforms? In some cases, yes. For example, economic crisis in Poland proved to most of the population that socialism was a bad system. And there was a period of extraordinary politics, but it would not have lasted for ages. So we have to move very fast. What is called shock therapy was the best therapy, given the situation initially. But in Argentina, in contrast, there were some genuine economic reforms, but they were not complete. And once external conditions worsened, situation worsened, and most of the people were convinced that they had deep recession because of previous market reforms. What is the general conclusion? The general conclusion, you have to fight for the popular interpretation of the crisis. And we've been losing this. The recent crisis, because the status interpretation that crisis was generated by excessive financial freedom, it's largely prevailing, and that central banks are saviors. And what is less communicated is that deep financial crises under capitalists have been produced by a combination of bad policies. Too big to fail, favoring borrowing instead of equity capital. There's at least 10 bad policies. So, communication again. If there's a crisis, don't waste it, but you have to lose the communication battle about root causes of the crisis. So much for a huge subject, which is policies under liberal democracy. Let me move to what I called bad transitions. What I mean by that is a deterioration in the rule of law, quality of democracy, civil rights, and after free elections. And I am not referring to the pre-war period, I am referring to the last 20 or 15 years. Okay. Now there are three categories of bad transition. First, completed. Means democracy, you don't have democracy because it's known who is going to win. So when I hear in the Western media that Putin has won elections, I'm asking why Western media are using propaganda, Putin's propaganda. What elections? What victory? But it's all over. CNN, BBC, etc., etc. We need the language. Language matters absolutely because it's a communication. If you use the language of populist inadvertently, you are engaging in populist propaganda. The study of language is absolutely necessary. So, completed bad transition, it is, as I say, Putin, in Belarus is Lukashenko, Erdogan in Turkey, and probably Orban in Hungary. At least I am referring what a prominent economist, Janusz Kornai, has said 2 years ago, that it is impossible to win elections in Hungary. We can discuss that. This is a border case. The second interesting category, which merits more studies, are democratically reversed bad transition. So free elections, you have a group which reduces the level of rule of law, civil rights, but loses elections. It's very important. I'm looking for it. So far, I have noticed on my list Macedonia. You have a nationalist, previous nationalist government who directly stemmed from Alexander the Great, you know, and Philip, Macedonian. And they lost elections. It's worth studying. And perhaps strangely enough, Sri Lanka. There were two strong generals and they lost elections. And the third category is a bad transition which has started but not finished. And Poland belongs to this category. It is up to us in Poland to organize better to reverse democratically. Which leads me to the second point, the distinction between why a bad group has won elections and then what happens next. One has to distinguish these two questions. Many people confuse it. With respect to the first question, you have to include that there are different combinations of factors which may have common elements, but they have also differences. So never generalize from one. So many people say it is because of populism. It is not an explanation, it is a name. Naming is not explaining. So let me take an example of Poland. The results of the last elections over 2 years ago were due to a lot of chance factors, which did not need to happen, but happened. I am not saying these elections were not legitimate, but they were due. One factor was that our previous president, a very nice guy, a decent fellow, I know him, a younger colleague, initially had 70% of popularity rating, and his opponent, the present president, has 3%. But the decent guy has lost elections. Why? Because he had an awful election campaign. And election campaign matters. So if bad guys have good election campaigns, it's a bad for the country. You have to be professional. So generally speaking, if bad guys have good luck, very bad for a country. Okay. And then two parties barely missed the threshold. And we have, all of a sudden, we have a situation where all the levers of powers were in the hands of one party, including presidency, which has the veto power. But the veto power was taken out. Okay, and then it was a start of what happened next. And here, let me share with you my small theory, which consists of 3 points. So every group which is basically not democratic, in the sense of a group which tries to perpetuate itself in power, has 3 tools at their disposal. First, it is clientelism or bribing, via distributing money from the budget and distributing jobs. Second is indoctrination via mass media. And the third, which is ultimate one, is intimidation. And intimidation is an ultimate factor because if a bad group captures tools of intimidation, he can win pseudo-elections under any economic situation. This was the essence of socialism. This is the situation in Venezuela. Now, the Polish situation is like that. I think the present ruling party has maximized bribing or clientelism. They cannot move any further because the budget is in the longer term in a bad situation and all the jobs in the state, public administration, state sector which can distribute, they have distributed. So they have to make turns. So they exhausted the possibilities of further. On propaganda, I think they achieved the maximum, ignoble maximum. So they cannot be more aggressive and stupid. They cannot. I think this is even worse than under communism, which is quite an achievement. So it is no further increase. They may enter a sphere of declining marginal productivity. You know, less and less people would believe. What is then left? Intimidation. We don't have a massive intimidation in Poland. This is not a situation in Turkey or Russia, but the tools of potential intimidation have been created by anti-constitutional legislation. And what are the tools? Police, secret police, prosecutors. And you can use it selectively, because what counts are the leaders. You target the leaders. So what is the response? The response is to increase the risk to bad guys who would serve bad rulers. And it means total watchdogs, no anonymity. Everybody who would serve bad rulers by breaking or violating Polish constitution and laws should be identified and never remembered. Never remembered. There's a power of social media and organized social resistance which will decide. I do not base my faith on just faith, forecast. I base on action. And we've been acting. And we act even more, so that people who would be ready to intimidate would be too much afraid of that. And with more actions, I am sure we are going to lose the battle for freedom and the rule of law in Poland. And the last word, perhaps, just in case, this is our job in Poland. This is up to us. But as far as the European Union is concerned, it is in their interest not to look passively at a flagrant violation of the treaties and European values as it was until now with the case of Orban. It is a shame. I think it's absolute shame. So we are not I am saying if European Union is not risking the loss of legitimacy, they had to act in their own interest, but this is not a substitute for our actions. At the minimum, they should not betray those who fight for freedom and rule of law in Poland. So they should not accept sham concession from the present ruling party. This is the minimum which they should do, or not do. Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes for discussion. So, unless you give up your coffee, I am ready to give up my coffee.
Any questions?
No.
Okay. If there are no more questions, then okay, there is one question, so we can have one question and then have a coffee break. The man in the red shirt again. Can you pass the microphone, please? From the...
So...
Switch on?
Maybe... it works? Yes. So maybe a short remark. I think what we've learned from all these lectures is that populists, collectivists base on fear. And I've talked recent days to a friend who is a scientist, and he had researched the role of emotions in politics. And it turned out that we as humans are much more, maybe we have a tendency to much more look at the negative communicates, and that's why they win. So it turned out we need 3 positive communicates to equalize 1 negative communicate. And my question is, so maybe in this situation the core word that we're searching for is courage and optimism.
Well, that's nice words, but they're not enough. Just to say, I am courageous and optimistic. It's not enough. You need a massive communication first. That's first. And second, I think the words of populists is too diffuse. And at a minimum, one should distinguish nationalistic populist and economic populist. Nationalistic populism are trying to say we and them. And they depict the foreigners as aliens, bad guys. Economic populists are statist. They increase political intervention, which sometimes is called state intervention, political intervention, and they promise quite a lot despite the facts. So I think I would be very, very prudent with the word populism, because it denotes too much. But remember, organization and communication is the key. And the first step in communication is the language. What words to unmask, what words to use, and pictures, and something which moves.
So, sorry, we are run out of time and we have to start the break now. So once again, thank you, Professor Balcerowicz. And we'll meet here in 15 minutes, so enjoy your coffee and...
Brilliant, as always. Enjoyed that.